First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodesh. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Acts, the 16th chapter. Now, in here, Paul begins his second missionary journey, along with Silas, okay? And as we saw at the end of the 15th chapter, there was a separation between Paul and Barnabas, in which Barnabas wanted to take Mark along with them on the second journey. Paul was not okay with that, and so they separated, and Barnabas went with Mark, as we read in Acts 15, onto Cyprus. All right, so that's this island here, while Paul chose Silas and went to, as it says, went through Syria and Cilicia. So I pulled up here a nice, beautiful map. Finally able to find a good one. So you can see all the way on the east here, right? It says Paul sets out from Antioch with Silas on his second missionary journey. So they didn't really have to go by water, by sea, because they could just travel through land, through from Syria to Cilicia, and then to the regions of Galatia, confirming those churches there that they had already set up. So this is Acts chapter 16, verse 1. Then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek. So, beginning Paul's missionary journey, which sources say this is around 49/50 AD to about 52 or so. But as he gets to, as you can see here, actually let's pull this one up. Let's use this one here. Derbe, right, and Lystra. There he finds Timothy. Okay. And so it says here, Timothy's mother was an Israelite, right? I mean, both his parents were Israelites, but she was a Jew, right? She actively, like knew the customs, kept the customs. We'll just say she was of the circumcision, so to speak. But his father, as it says, because she also believed, right? She was a believer. But his father, as it says here, was a Greek. Now, his father was still an Israelite, but he was, today you would say he was in the world, right? So he was one that practiced Greek customs. An Israelite that didn't know he was an Israelite, to the on surface value or face value, it just looked like he was, just another person walking around, right? But his line really goes back to Israel, because remember, going back to the time of the Maccabees, and even sometime before then and around then, you had a lot of Israelites that fled into different lands. They took on the Greek customs and sort of just lived in that way. So Timothy's father here was an Israelite. He was just one that practiced the Greek customs. So Paul meets Timothy here, right? Which was well reported by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. So these churches here in the region of Galatia, the believers, which is what it means by the brethren, recommended like Timothy in the sense that, they spoke well of him. And so Paul was pleased to take Timothy with him, right? Verse 3, him, that is Timothy, would Paul have to go forth with him. So he wanted to take Timothy along with him on his journey, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters. So to avoid any back and forth, Paul circumcised Timothy because, as it says, because of the Jews that were there, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. So they knew that, for that reason, likely when Timothy was raised up, he probably wasn't circumcised. So like I said, to just avoid any back and forth or any speaking on that, he just had Timothy circumcised. And as they went through the cities, they delivered them the decrees for to keep that were ordained of the apostles and elders which were at Jerusalem. So this was after, remember, after the Jerusalem Council, where it had been, officially decreed, okay, for the Israelites that were coming in, that weren't raising the customs, they weren't keeping these customs there, but they believe these are the things that they should adhere to, right? But don't burden them with all these extra laws and so on. So that decree, they as it says, delivered to the believers and the churches in that region. And so were the churches established in faith. So their faith was strengthened, knowing now, okay, this is like, we don't have to worry, right, about, any extraness, right? We can just focus on strengthening our faith and keeping the charge of Yahweh Shai, and increased in number daily. So you had more and more people that were, believing and joining. Now, when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, and were forbidden of the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. So let's take a look back here. So from Derbe, right, and Lystra, they went through this whole region, right? Iconium, Antioch, and you just following the red line. Phrygia, you can see here, it's written, a bit sideways, right on the left of Antioch. So they went through, after they passed through Phrygia, it says that the Spirit in the region of Galatia, they were forbidden of the Spirit to preach the word in Asia. So that's that region here. So that's why they didn't go down yet to, Thyatira or like Ephesus or that area. So the Lord was guiding them and leading them exactly where he wanted them to go. Verse 7, actually, Salakia, 1 second. Verse 7, after they were come to Mysia, they essayed to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit suffered them not. So once again, let's take a look over here. So we have here, if you follow the red line on the east of Troas, right, Mysia, that region right there. After they had come into that region, they wanted to go Bithynia. You can see that's northwest of Mysia, but the Spirit said, nah, that's not, the Lord didn't want them to go there. And they passed by Mysia and came down to Troas, right, which we just saw on the west over there. So this is basically at the border of Asia Minor. And next stop, they're pretty much crossing here. This is, probably still a part of the Aegean, but crossing here now into Europe. So it says here, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, which is like basically begged him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia. So the author here, being Luke, right, was obviously journeying with them. So they go into Macedonia. So they cross, right? Let me finish this verse and we'll take a look at the map again. Assuredly, gathering that the Lord had called us for to preach the gospel unto them. So through Paul's vision, right, they were made sure that, okay, the Lord had ordained and called them, and he wanted them to go over into Macedon, right, or Macedonia, to go and preach the gospel over there to them. So they cross over from Thrace, landing at Samothrace, and then making their way across to Philippi, right? Philippi, Neapolis. So it says here, now, where were we at? Verse 11. Therefore, loosing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, and the next day to Neapolis. Okay. And, what I'm thinking now is, in the parts where it's really just going into their journeyings, I'll just keep the map up while I read it from my phone. And when it comes to other parts where it's needful to see the wording or looking at some of the root words there, then I'll pull up the blue letter again. So Acts 17 and 11, these, it's like Acts 16 and 11. Therefore, loosing from Troas, so you can see that port right there, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, that small little island over there, and the next day to Neapolis. And that Neapolis is right there next to Philippi. So it says here, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia. So from that region, it was like one of the main cities over there. And the reason was because it was a colony, right? As it says here, a chief city of that part of Macedonia and a colony. And we were in that city abiding certain days. Now, the special thing about the colony, if we look up here, Roman colony, which I also wonder if the blue letter might have something on that. Okay, actually it does. So let's take a look there. This is verse 12. So if we look at the dictionaries and we look for the word colony. So it says here, the city of Philippi was a Roman colony, Acts 16 and 12, i.e. a military settlement for Roman soldiers and citizens, kind of like veterans and citizens planted there to keep in subjection, and I guess not just veterans alone, but possibly you could have veterans there as well. But as it mentions, for Roman soldiers and citizens planted there to keep in subjection a newly conquered district. A colony was Rome in miniature, under Roman municipal law, but governed by military officers, right? That was praetors and lictors, not by proconsuls. And proconsuls were the main consuls. Proconsuls were the main ones that governed in other parts of Rome. But here they had praetors, as it says, and lictors, and these were different offices or magistrates in the Roman ranks. It had an independent internal government, the jus Italicum, i.e. the privileges of Italian citizens. So that was one of the reasons why it was one of the chief cities of that part of Macedonia. So now we know that they're at Philippi, right? So I'll put the map on hold for now. Let's read a little bit more here. And on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made. So at a place where, people would come to pray. And we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. And so the women that came there to pray, they basically preached to them. And there came a woman named Lydia, a seller of purple. And this purple here it's not like it's a dye, right? Usually it will be a dye that would be used to make like certain garments. And sometimes it might be the garment itself. But if you look this up here, I'm not sure if they mention it. They mention it in the interlinear. But in the Old Testament, it mentions like being clothed in purple. So it says here, a female seller of purple or fabrics dyed in purple. What made this purple so special was, if we look up here, Tyrian purple. This is actually very expensive. So it says Tyrian purple or royal imperial purple is a highly prized ancient reddish purple dye derived from the mucus of predatory Mediterranean sea snails. It was extraordinarily expensive, often worth its weight in gold or silver, because thousands of snails were needed to produce mere grams of dye, requiring a laborious, smelly, and complex multi-day production process. Used primarily for elite, royal, and priestly garments, it symbolized supreme power, wealth, and status. So it's not like she was running around with some random purple stuff. But there's there's a reason why she sold this. It was lucrative. So, as it mentions here, she was one who heard Paul preaching. It says here, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord had opened. So the Lord had opened up her mind to be able to believe. And she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. So she gave heed to them. And when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. So she basically urged Paul and his company. Remember, you have Luke with him, Timothy, Silas. So she basically housed them while they stayed at Philippi. And it came to pass as we went to prayer. So, some time later, the next day probably, when they went back to the same place to pray, a certain damsel, so a young woman, possessed with a spirit of divination met us. And divination is when you divine, it's like fortune telling. So she had a demon on her that would basically allow her to divine or to fortune tell. And so she met Paul and company, which brought her masters much gain by soothsaying, which is divining or fortune telling. So you can imagine whether it was like bets or whatever it is they would do, they had that advantage because they could use the demon that was on her to make gain by knowing what the outcome of said thing would be. The same followed Paul and us and cried, saying, these men are the servants of the Most High God, which shew unto us the way of salvation. Why did she say that? Because the demon in her recognized that, right? The demon knew and recognized them. And so every time she saw them, she would just keep saying that, right? It says she cried that after them. And this did she many days. So every day that they would go there to go in, every time they would go there to pray, she would be back with her shit. And it got annoying. But Paul, being grieved, turned and said to the spirit, I command thee in the name of Yahushua HaMashiach to come out of her. And he came out the same hour. So the demon, fled out of her. And when her masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, so she wasn't able to divine anymore, who did this? They caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace onto the rulers. So they brought them to the marketplace area where the soldiers and those that were in charge were, and brought them to the magistrates, saying, and the magistrates were those that were actually, like, let's say like the I don't want to say governor, so I'll just click here and see what word they used. Okay, so it says here in the New Testament, a civic commander, I guess governor was okay as well. The name of the highest magistrate in the municipia or colonies. They had the power of administering justice in the less important cases. Because remember what we read about the colony, right? They had their own internal government. So they bring Paul and Silas before the ones in charge, saying, these men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city. And they were really upset because they lost their ability to make that money. So they're saying these people are troublemakers. They're causing trouble throughout. And teach customs that are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. So they're teaching ways that are not according to what us as Romans should do. It's in violation of the lawful deeds that we're supposed to do. And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes, and that is, they caused you sort of had like a small kind of mob forming, like people protesting against them, like, oh, yo, get them out of here. We don't want them here. Don't bring that new stuff over here. Trying to get people to go after your beliefs. We don't do that over here. So the magistrates, witnessing that, caused Paul and Silas to have their clothes taken off. And then, as it says, they beat them. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison. Now, it's what, two verses on here, but you can imagine the actual experience. Imagine being beaten with rods, or whips, and many stripes. That's not fun or easy. You might even have bruises. Not even might, you will have bruises. So they beat him enough And then they cast them into prison, charging the jailer, the one who was in charge, to keep them safely, to make sure that they don't escape and they stay right there. Who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. So he locked them up. And when you make your feet fast in the stocks, fast meaning firm, these are what the stocks look like. All right, let's say feet in stocks. And if left over a long period of time, it becomes actually very painful. So it looks something like, yeah, I suppose these are all not bad. So like you're either standing or in this case seated, right? Something like this. And your feet are, locked in that position. So you see how they're seated like this? They can't stand up, right? They can't stand up because if they were to stand up, the board would have to, turn or flip the other way, but they couldn't do that. So eventually what will happen is, how if you sit for a long time, your leg dies, so to speak. But in this case, your legs will actually start to hurt, and you'd want to stand up and bend them or stretch them, but you can't. So it looked light, but it became a painful thing, after not too long. So he put him in this position, and at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. Can you imagine that? Like a real, actually imagine that. The building just starts shaking. You hear the metal, right, of the bars, just and immediately the doors were open. So imagine that, the gates just flinging open, and everyone's bands were loose. So all the shackles that were on them immediately fell off. And the keeper of the prisoner, awaking out of his sleep, because it's midnight, he's probably knocked out at this point, but he hears this. He hears the door slamming open. He's like, he feels the shaking of the ground. He's like, whoa. So he wakes up. He goes to check, and he sees the prison doors are open. Oh, it's magic. Not that kind. So when he saw that, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, because he thought, I'm so screwed. Because like it's not one or two prisoners. All the gates are open. Do you know what they're gonna do to me if they find out that they're gonna think I let these people go? If I say I fell asleep and I woke up and the doors were open, who's gonna believe that? So out of fear, he thought they had fled, so he was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had been fled. But Paul cried with a loud voice, saying, "Do thyself no harm, for we are all here." So no. Easy. No, nobody left. We're still here. Then he called for a light and sprang in. So you can keep in mind it's also dark, right? So the jailer gets a light, probably a torch or whatever form of light they had, and quickly, he goes in there and came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas, and brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" So it's likely that he had heard also the commotion of what was going on, why it is that Paul and Silas even ended up there. But having experienced this, he was like, yo, these guys might actually be the real deal. And they said, "Believe on the Lord Yahushua HaMashiach, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house." So you and your household will be saved if you believe on the Lord. And they spake unto him the word of the Lord Yahweh, Bahasham Yahushai, and to all that were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night, and washed their stripes, and was baptized, he and all his straightway. So he basically, took them. He, he treated their wounds, and then he was baptized of them, as it says, he and his whole house. And when he had brought them into his house, he set meat before them. That is, he basically, made some food for them and everything, or had a meal prepared for them, and rejoiced, believing in God with all his house. And when it was day, the magistrates sent the sergeants, saying, "Let those men go." So he takes them to his house, right? He's baptized of them. They preach unto him. He gives them a meal and everything. And then they go back. So when they go back the next day, the magistrates sent the sergeants. Now, when you look up the word sergeants here, these were, as it says here, a lictor, right? One who carries the rods, i.e. the fasces. Now, the fasces was a certain symbol. It was like a binding of sticks with like an axe in Roman times. And let's look that up. Roman lictor. There you go. So it says here, lictor fasces refers to the bundle of birch rods, often with an axe, carried by lictors or attendants in ancient Rome, symbolizing a magistrate's power or imperium to enforce laws, punish, and execute, with the axe removed within Rome's sacred boundary to protect citizens' rights, later becoming the symbol of Mussolini's Italian fascist party. So if we look here, that's what it looks like. That's the right there, the stakes and so on. And let me see if there's some more on here. It says here, I'll just read it real quick. A fasces is a bound bundle of wooden rods, often but not always including an axe, with its blade emerging. The fasces is an Italian symbol that had its origin in the Etruscan civilization and was passed on to ancient Rome, where it symbolized a Roman king's power to punish his subjects, and later a magistrate's power and jurisdiction. So when he sent these, let me see what they have for the lictors. Let's see if we just... Yeah, so you see they're carrying the fasces right there. A lictor was a Roman civil servant who was an attendant and bodyguard to a magistrate who held imperium. Roman records describe lictors as having existed since the Roman kingdom, and they may have originated with the Etruscans. So it says here, the task, right? A lictor's main role was to bodyguard the imperium possessing magistrates to which they were assigned. They also carried the magistrate's fasces, which symbolized that magistrate's imperium. The fasces also served to intimidate a crowd, since they contained all the necessary equipment to administer corporal and capital punishment. Stories going back to the origin of the Republic attest to magistrates ordering their lictors to serve as executioners. Their role in a magistrate's imposition of official punishment seems to have continued through to late antiquity. So they would basically go around enforcing whatever the magistrate wants. If it's to whip somebody, they got the sticks on there. If it's to kill somebody, they got the axe on there. So they were like the force of the magistrate. So the magistrate sent them to go and say, hey, release Paul and Silas. And the keeper of the prison told this saying to Paul, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now, therefore, depart and go in peace. But Paul said unto them, they have beaten us openly uncondemned, right? We weren't condemned. We didn't have a trial, but they beat us openly, being Romans. And that was the thing, right? Like being a Roman or a Roman citizen, because that's what he means here, you have rights. And if it was violated, that could be a real issue. That could be even a civil case right there. So that's why Paul is using this, saying, being Romans and have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privately? So now they want to like cover it up and just like release us secretly? No. You beat us openly and we're Roman citizens. Nay, verily, let them come themselves and fetch us out. So they were back in the prison and they were like, let them come and get us out themselves. Those same magistrates that had us go through this. And so we know Paul was a Roman citizen, but here, even though there's no explicit part in the scriptures that says that Silas also was a Roman citizen, based on Paul's language here, it implies that Silas might have also had a Roman citizenship, right? Because he mentions here being Romans, right? And have cast us into prison, which included Silas. Anyway, it says, and the surgeons told these words unto the magistrates, and they feared when they heard that they were Romans. And this is the same card that Paul pulled when later on in the future when we get there, right? When he was examined or interrogated, but I believe it was more, physical beating in Jerusalem, right? When there was a whole uproar and they were trying to kill him. And they were afraid once they heard he was a Roman, because you can't just treat a Roman citizen like that. So in any case, when they heard this, they were afraid, and they came and besought him and brought them out and desired them to depart out of the city. He said, look, please, look, we didn't know. Let's not make this a big deal. Come on, just, how about this? Why don't you just leave the city? And they went out of the prison and entered into the house of Lydia, right? The lady that they met at the place of prayer. And when they had seen the brethren, they comforted them and departed. So this is all the things that transpired in Philippi, right? When, they had a body of believers there, i.e. known as the brethren. So before leaving, right, they comforted them, they exhorted them. And then Paul and his company leave Philippi. So if we go back to the map here, they are now next stop going to, what is this, Apollonia, and then going from there. So that brings us to the end of the book of Acts, the 16th chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.